Good morning. You get to hear from me again. It's been so long since we last talked. Before we get started, I would just like to introduce you to our friend over here, Lou, aka Lumen, the lightning bug. He was our camp mascot. Great help this week. So if you were wondering, this is Lou. Second of all, before I forget, if you were helping with kids camp at all this week, either decorating last Sunday or before that, or were with kids or making lunch, would you please stand briefly so we can thank you? Shirley and Courtney, Keith, yeah. Thank you. So, it has been a very busy summer here at Second, from our middle school students gathering in different locations for service projects. There's been some D&D campaigns, high school students traveling around the world, kids cooking camps down in Westminster, and then most recently, of course, kids camp. So there's been a lot going on for kids. But if you've been in the building at all this summer during the week, you have probably heard a fair amount of screaming. And I will be the first to say that it does, in fact, wear on you a little bit. And yet, we know that these are the sounds of kids running around and screaming, laughing, snorting, various other more or less identifiable sounds. Sometimes we don't ask questions. And we know that these are the sounds of connection, of childhood, and of God at work. Second Kids Ministries is guided by 5 core principles: that kids would be safe, be known, be loved, belong, and be heard. We, of course, have a long list of learning goals to go along with that, but every lesson we share, camp we host, retreat we offer, is guided by these principles. So I know that something drove you all out of bed and into the pews this morning, and it wasn't because you were looking forward to a hot sauna session, but I suspect it's because there was something special about this place. Showing up here is different than showing up to class on a random Thursday morning when it's super cloudy and cold. It's different than clocking in for work for another day full of meetings that probably could have been an email. I'm suspicious that church is a place where you can be loved in the fullness of your identity and being. A place where you are known and connect with other people who are also curious about living a life modeled after the life of Jesus. A place where you are safe to ask questions, be critical, grow, and transform. All of this is true for our kids as well. We might be tempted to fall into a fear-based way of thinking when we think about caring for our kids, fearing that if we don't have all the right things, if we don't have the best curriculum, if we don't do everything just right, that we will fail them, that they will not grow up to be Christians, that they will leave the church, and then who knows what. Our theme this last week at Kids Camp was Psalm, not song, Psalm like your palm, with a silent P. It's a tricky one. Psalm 56:3. Whenever I'm afraid, I put my trust in you. I'm going to read that one more time. Whenever I'm afraid, I put my trust in you. Each day we explored a different story from the Bible in which God shows us that we can trust our Creator to care for us, to do transformative works in our lives. On Monday, we learned that we can trust God to go with us, just as God went with Jacob in Genesis 28:10-22. We heard about Jacob who, after tricking his father and stealing from his brother, fled into the unknown. He had a dream in which God spoke directly to him and reminded him that even if he didn't realize it, he was never alone, that God was always with him, that God would keep the promises made to Jacob. we learned that we can also trust God to keep promises made to us, to be with us, even when we travel into our own unknowns. Tuesday, we read Ruth chapter 1, which you all got to participate in this morning, with Naomi and Ruth. And the part where Ruth and Naomi are talking, and Ruth says to Naomi, "I will go where you go. I will live where you live. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. I will never leave you as long as I live." I think about how sweet it would be to hear those words spoken to me by somebody who really cared for me. Neither of them knew what the future held, but they trusted God to lead the way. On Wednesday, we learned that we can trust God to share wisdom through the story of Jesus in the temple in Luke 2:41 through 52. On their long journey, Jesus and his parents were on their way back to their home in Nazareth, and Jesus' parents noticed that their 12-year-old son was not where he was supposed to be. I thought 12-year-olds were always supposed to be where they're supposed to be, but turns out that is not so even for Jesus. So they headed back to Jerusalem to look for him. He was missing for 3 days. And I can only imagine how his parents were feeling. Mary and Joseph found him in the temple, talking with the teachers, learning from them, asking questions, and also Jesus was sharing with them, teaching them. His parents were likely frustrated and worried, and they did not understand why he needed to leave them without permission to be in the temple. And later in life, in Jesus' life, his disciples would also struggle with the same lack of understanding. But Jesus shared God's wisdom with his parents. He would share God's wisdom with his disciples, and God shares wisdom with us too. So we talked a lot about what wisdom is and how it's different than knowing everything. On Thursday, we learned that we can trust God to give us peace through the story of Jesus calming the storm in Mark 4:35 through 41. One day, Jesus set out on the Sea of Galilee with his disciples, and they encountered a storm. This worked out really well because there was a storm the night before, on Wednesday night. Gale force winds arose and waves crashed the boat so that the boat was swamped. And the disciples, who would have included a number of professional fishermen who would have encountered plenty of storms, just like this one, were scared. And where was Jesus? Asleep in the back of the boat. And so the disciples could not believe that he was sleeping through all of the chaos. They woke him up, asking if he even cared that they were about to die. And that reminds me a lot of like my son waking me up in the middle of the night and how I might feel about that. And when Jesus was awoken, because of the storm that he was not concerned about, he did not rebuke his disciples, but rather he rebuked the storm. He got up and gave orders to the wind, and he said to the lake, "Silence, be still." The storm became silent and still. And just as Jesus brought peace to the disciples on the Sea of Galilee, we can also trust God to give us peace during the storms that crash against our lives. And while those storms do not always subside as quickly as the ones in Mark chapter 4, we know that, like the disciples, we're beginning to understand that God is with us throughout every storm and can bring us peace. Finally, we made it to Friday of a wonderful long week. And we learned that we can trust God to spark joy. And you have to say it that way also, if you were wondering. In Acts chapter 8, verses 26 through 40, we heard about one of Jesus' followers, Philip, who was sharing the good news of Jesus. An angel from God told Philip to take a particular path on his journey where he encountered an Ethiopian man. Despite being a Gentile, this man was interested in Israel's God and had been in Jerusalem being in the temple, learning about this God. On his way back home, he was reading aloud from the book of Isaiah. Philip heard him reading this passage and knew this must be the guy. So he ran to the man and shared the good news of Jesus' resurrection with him, baptizing him as they came upon some water. The passage ends with the Ethiopian man going on his way and rejoicing in the events that had occurred. Philip's acceptance and baptism of the man shows us that no barrier exists for the man who wanted to worship the risen Jesus and his inclusion of the community of the church. Nothing hinders us from being baptized and rejoicing in the good news of Jesus as well. So, it was a long week. It was a good week. And throughout the week, we talked about these stories, and we heard them woven in our crafts, in our science experiments, in our games, while we were laughing and making new friends, even while some of the leaders were talking, as you do. And we heard stories over and over again of the ways that people in the Bible trusted God. So, what stands out to me about all of these stories, and so many others in the Bible, is that they are not about information, but rather they are about relationships. Brothers, in-laws, friends, teachers and students, even strangers. And God shares these truths with us through the stories of connections. In the same way, Christian education is not just about information, but it's about transformation through relationship. Each day this week, we had volunteers show up, spending time with kids, trusting that God would do the transformative work. It didn't matter if they got every part of the craft just right, or if the science experiment didn't actually do what it was supposed to do. What mattered is that they showed up with kindness and grace. They created an environment in which kids felt safe and cared for. They shared the good news of the faithfulness of God and trusted that God would do the transformative work. So, my question to you is this: what if, instead of wringing our hands and fretting over getting things exactly right with our kids, we commit to showing up, to creating a space where kids can feel safe, known, loved, where they can belong and be heard? How might God use the relationships that they form while they're running wild around the church, screaming, laughing, snorting sometimes, to transform their hearts? What deeper knowledge and understanding of the love of Christ might we all know if we committed to trusting that the Holy Spirit is at work in all of us, including the youngest among us? That every time we share a laugh, we are laying the foundation that allows us to feel safe in asking hard questions, feel loved even when we don't feel lovable, and feel like church is not just a place like school or work where we have to morph ourselves into an acceptable version of a person, but that we can truly be ourselves and truly belong. What would it look like for us to fully put our trust in God to transform us and to transform our children? So, as you leave today, receive these words from Kate Bowler's blessing for the ones who bear witness. This blessing has been very inspirational for me in planning our next year of children's ministries here at Second. For the ones who bear witness, blessed are the noticers, the ones who see the story in its fullness. Blessed are the attenders, the witness bearers, the story holders, the ones who tiptoe to the edge right alongside us, knowing that the very act will break their heart in pieces too, choosing us anyway. Blessed are those who are amazed by a life lived in its fragility, in its brevity, in its beauty. Blessed are the ones who stand close enough to say, "Behold, behold, this is their love. Behold, this is their annoying habit. Behold, these are the people they loved and know so much about they could implicate or exonerate them in a crime. Behold, these are their exes and their favorite songs to belt out in the car, and their fast food orders. Behold, this is not a problem to be solved. This is a person to be loved. This is the miracle we get to call by name. And how lucky are we? These people, these loves, these precious, precious, precious days. Thanks be to God. Amen.